level, if you've walked through something in the past or you're walking through something now, my genuine desire is that now at this point you're sort of beginning to move towards a future that's a little different because of some of the things we've talked about. Hopefully we've given some insight and some life to some of the things that maybe have happened in your past or even happening in your present. But tonight we're actually going to wrap up by answering, I think, one of the larger unresolved questions that I see come up when people are walking through times of very acute pain or times of specific suffering. In fact, this is one of those questions that when I sit with people who are literally in the moment of experiencing tragedy, and even later years down the road, it's the same question that always comes back up. And it's the question that I think people really desire to have an answer for, and it's this. Can the valley that I've walked through, can this thing that I'm experiencing, can this moment that I'm in right now, can it have some kind of purpose? I think there's something about us as human beings that longs for the difficult things we've walked through to not just be meaningless and senseless. I think when we look at our lives and we go through something particularly painful, and then we consider the reality that this might be a meaningless suffering or a senseless suffering, it's like that begins to hit us at a level that's far deeper than just, I'm dealing with some sort of suffering, but I know where this is going to lead. I think when we walk through something and we see no end in sight, we see no good, we see nothing coming out of this, I think there's a deeper tension that can rise up inside of us. And so we ask this question, is there any good? I mean, I've sat with people even recently who have said, I just hope that I can see somehow at the other side of this, that there's some good in this. I hope I see that there's a change that happens because of this thing that I'm walking through right now. The answer to that question, the answer to whether or not you and I can gain something, learn something, grow from something, see something good come from something that we're walking through, the answer to that question, I believe, is a resounding yes. I think there is a yes that answers that question. Can it have some kind of purpose? Yes, I truly believe that. And so tonight, what I want to walk through is exactly how that happens. How do you and I get on the other side of this valley and then realize that some good things have happened? And in order to answer that question, there are really two parts to this. And the first half has to do with us as individuals. The second half has to do with our influence in other people's lives. And so tonight, we're going to look at the work that God does in us, and then we're going to look at the work that God does through us. And I believe that when you see both of these things, you'll realize there's a resolution to this question that hangs in our minds of whether or not there's any sort of purpose in this. So first, I want to talk about the work that he does in us. And in order to do that, I want to begin by looking at a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church that was in Rome. Kind of an interesting thing. The Apostle Paul wrote this letter to the Roman church, and not surprisingly, they were experiencing suffering. There's two reasons they were experiencing suffering. Number one was they're human beings. So if you've been here through this series, you know one of the things we've talked about is suffering and pain is something that is part of the human experience. We walk through valleys. That is a universal shared reality that all of us will experience in this room. And so on one hand, the Romans were experiencing pain simply because they're human beings. They breathe in and breathe out, and so that makes them subject to some sort of suffering. But secondarily, the Romans also experienced suffering because they were Christians. This Roman church, they were Christians living in the city of Rome and living under the rule of the Roman Empire. And if you know your history very well, then you know that the Roman Empire was not particularly fond of Christians, and the intensity of persecution was growing throughout the history of the Roman Empire. And so these people were experiencing a specific kind of suffering, an acute suffering, because of the Roman Empire, because of the reality that they were Christians that were just simply living in Rome. So they were experiencing these sort of things. So the Apostle Paul, he writes this letter to them and he sends it off to them. And as you read this letter, there are all these different chapters that we've broken the letter into so that we can sort of find our place in it. But when you get to what we would call chapter 8 of this letter, it becomes very clear that this portion of the letter is a part that is completely about living in a world that is marked by brokenness, a world that requires us living through suffering, living through valleys. In fact, in Romans chapter 8, the Apostle Paul's talking to them, and he's talking about trouble. And he uses that word. He talks about the trouble that people walk through, and he talks about the persecution that they were experiencing. And he talks about nakedness and poverty, this idea of being stripped of everything that you own. And he talks about just sadness and sorrow, all these different things in Romans chapter 8. And then he moves into what it looks like to be a Christian person, a follower of Jesus, in those circumstances. He talks about this. So all of these things, you look at it, and Trouble, persecution, nakedness, poverty. He's talking about all these hardships. And then he says, in the middle of this, this is how you are supposed to understand these things. This is how you live through these things. And in verse 28 of Romans chapter 8, there's this iconic verse that my guess is, in just a second we'll find out, many of you have heard before, but it's incredibly powerful. It's this verse that unfortunately has been misused at times, but it has a power to answer the question that we're asking around our suffering and our valleys and our pain. And that is there some sort of good that will come from this? Romans chapter 8, verse 28, he's talking about trouble, persecution, poverty, nakedness. And then he says this, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who were called according to his purpose." How many of you have heard this verse before? Okay, good chunk of us, right? There's a possibility that some of you have actually heard this verse before, and you heard it at a time when you really weren't ready to hear it, right? Like you were in the middle of a valley, you were in the middle of a circumstance, and some insensitive person who wasn't really thinking about how this would sound to you came alongside of you and said, in the middle of your bad time, in the middle of your misery or suffering, they said, "Oh, don't worry, all things work together for good." And you probably in that moment wanted to say some choice things to them, right? Like, how in the world do you say this to me? How do you say in the middle of this bad thing that it can somehow turn into a good thing? How would you even utter those words, much less think to say them to someone like me, right? Some of you maybe have had that experience. But this verse says something that's powerful. It's addressing something that I think is incredibly important for us to understand. But I think we have to look at this verse for some of the things we don't typically look at. Sometimes we look at the good things working together, and we don't realize that there's a part of this we often leave out of this. If you look at this verse, you'll notice that it says that all things happen to Christians. All things. He says, and we know that for those who love God, all things. When he says all things, what's he talking about? Well, what he's saying is that a Christian's circumstances, just because you're a Jesus follower, your circumstances are no better or no different than anybody else's. It turns out that terrible things happen to people who love God. Bad things do happen to good people. All things, right? In fact, many Christians teach, and I think a lot of Christians even believe this, that if you love and serve God, then you won't have as many bad things happen to you. In fact, I think sometimes that sort of thinking and that sort of teaching is what causes frustration in our faith today. Because somewhere along the line, we started believing that if we love God and we serve God, then fewer bad things will happen to me. But when bad things happen, I'm frustrated with God. And yet right here in his word, we don't have God promising that bad things won't happen to us. In fact, he's saying the opposite. All things will happen to you. All of the same things, all of the same circumstances, the same losses, the same tragedies, the same difficulties, the same letdowns that happen to anybody else, they're going to happen to you. Being a Christ follower doesn't change that. All means all things. In fact, in verse 35, he moves on and he says to these Christian people that are listening to this, he says, "What can separate us from the love of Christ? Can trouble, can hardship, can persecution, can famine, can poverty, danger, the sword?" All of these things, he's saying, listen, this is stuff you're going to encounter, right? And he's speaking to the hardship that we know, except for the sword part. Most of us haven't been threatened by anybody with a sword lately, right? But other than that, these are all things that we know. We know hardship and trouble and persecution and famine and poverty and danger. These are common experiences among all people and among Christians. So he's actually talking about the reality that we experience the love of Jesus in moments when that sort of stuff is going on. That's the context of this. These things happen to everybody else and they happen to us. I think that's incredibly important for us to think about and let that sink into our understanding of who God is and how he operates. I think absorbing that into our thinking, absorbing that into our understanding of our relationship with God has the potential to radically shape and rethink how we actually approach God. The difference that loving God makes is not whether or not these things will happen. The difference that loving and serving God makes is what happens when those things happen. That's actually the difference that Paul's talking about here. He says, listen, bad things happen, and God will work those things for good. Are you with me so far? So, Let me be really clear about what he's not saying when he says these things work out for good. He is not saying that bad things are actually good things and you just don't see it clearly. Okay, that is not what he's saying here. That's not it. In fact, I know people that try to spin this way. They've tried to say it that way. Oh, you know what? I know this seems dark and really bad and really horrible, but let me just trust me. This is a good thing. And like, this is not a good thing. This is a bad thing. It feels like a bad thing. It is a bad thing. Everybody around me says it's a bad thing. Don't tell me it's not a bad thing. I have a friend, she has a saying that occasionally she'll say to me. She'll say, don't pee on my leg and tell me that it's raining. Whenever she says that, I always, first I'm like, that's really gross. That's a gross thing. But I get it, right? Because that's the sort of thing that people try to do in moments of crisis and sorrow, right? Like you're going through this thing and people are like, oh, don't worry, like it'll all work out for good. And you're like, no, this is really bad. How in the world can you tell me this is good? This seems really bad. Paul is not telling us that bad things are actually good things. He's not telling you to simply pretend your way through it, that your faith somehow allows you to just sort of fake it until you make it. That's not what he's saying. These verses actually acknowledge that there are bad things, but it promises that even though there are bad things happening, there is good that is being worked out in the middle of them. And there's a difference. There's a difference. So the promise is not that if you love God, bad things won't happen. The promise is not that if you love God, the bad things really aren't bad things. The promise is God is going to take those bad things that happen to you, and he's going to somehow work through those things, through those situations and through those circumstances, and he is going to accomplish something that in the totality of your life, when you consider your life, you will say, as bad as that was, I see how God used that for good. In fact, when it says all things work together for good, that doesn't mean like you're going to see the good in the first week that you're having bad things happen, right? Don't hold God to this, right? Like, it's not like somehow in the middle of it, you're going to be in the middle of this bad moment and then God's just going to show you, but look, in like 3 weeks, this is how it's going to work out. Don't do that in this regard. Don't do that with these things. Don't do that in a month. Don't do that for a decade. Don't try to determine how it's going to work out in a good way. That's not the promise here. The promise isn't for a month or a week or a decade or whatever. The promise is not that you're going to see every bad patch and how it worked out perfectly. The promise is just simply that God is going to work this out. In the totality of your life, he is going to use this, and it will not be wasted. Everything has a place in your story. And all of this is built on an important principle that I think we need to understand around Jesus. Jesus Christ did not suffer on a cross so that you and I would not suffer in this lifetime. That is not the reason that he went to the cross. He suffered so that when you and I suffer, we have a choice. He didn't suffer to eliminate suffering. Otherwise, we wouldn't be experiencing suffering. And last time I checked, we're still experiencing suffering, right? So that means that when he was on that cross, his purpose for being there was that we would have an opportunity to choose in the middle of our suffering. And what do we have an opportunity to choose? What can we choose from? We can choose whether or not we will be changed and shaped into his likeness. In fact, the gospel doesn't promise you better life circumstances. It promises you a better life, regardless of your circumstances. Which is what he gets to in the next few verses. In verse 29, in the next verse, Paul talks about how we will be conformed into the image of Christ. So he's talking about these good things for people who love God. He talks about God's purposes. And in the next verse, he sort of reveals to us what those purposes are, what these good things might look like. These good things end up being you and I looking more like Jesus. In fact, the Greek term that's used in Romans 8:29 is the word morpha. It's where we get our word metamorphosis. And so what he is describing is a deep change inside of us. He's talking about the very essence of who we are changing into an essence that is like Jesus. So here's sort of what he's talking about. Some of us in the room, in fact, I know this is probably always the case that maybe you are in a place where you don't really know how you feel yet about this whole church religion thing, but what I hear people say, whether you're in the church or outside the church, I hear people say this all the time. I don't know about that stuff, but I know that I'm really interested or fascinated in who Jesus is. In fact, I know people that say things like, I really love Jesus, I just don't know how I feel about the church. Like it's sort of a mixed bag, right? I hear that sort of thing. When I hear that sort of thing, it always perks my ears because I always wonder, what is it that we love about Jesus? Because truth be told, most of us in the room, we're in this room because there's something compelling about Jesus, right? You read the biographies of Jesus and you see his wisdom, or you see his patience, you see his determination, and there's something that's attractive about that. Or maybe you see his sense of purpose and meaning, and there's something that draws you into that purpose and meaning. Or maybe it's his compassion and the way that he treats people, his mercy and his patience with others, and there's something that compels you. It's his love, it's his grace, it's all of these things that you see in Jesus and go, man, I love what I see in Jesus. Like, I think there are all sorts of things that all kinds of people love about Jesus. And what Paul is talking about in these verses is that when you and I walk through these moments and God is working things out for good, what he means is that you and I are becoming those very things that we love about Jesus. It's in the middle of our circumstances that God is shaping us into a person that is more compassionate and more loving and more wise because we see the world differently, because we've had some experiences and we've changed. Somebody who lives with compassion and mercy to those around them because of the very things that we've walked through ourselves. He's working things out for good. He's shaping us into the things that we love about Jesus. That's what Paul's talking about. And if you love God, everything that happens in your life, it's going to mold you and sculpt you and polish you and shape you into the image of his Son. So that's what's happening inside of you. Is there something? Is there meaning? Is there purpose in the valley? Yes. There's this shaping, there's this forming, there's this metamorphosis that's going on inside of you, and God will take even the worst of circumstances to allow you to become more like Jesus. Interestingly enough, when you become more like Jesus, you begin to really impact the second half of this, which is the work that he does through you. As you think about Jesus' life, he did so much of what he did for others, right? And interestingly enough, as you become like Jesus, you begin to realize that part of the good that God's doing is not just for you as an individual, but it's also about what he does through you. I've observed some interesting things about humanity. How many of you, does anybody in the room really like, I'm going to talk about music for just a second. Does anybody like blues music? Raise your hand up if you like the blues. Keep it up there. Come on, keep it up there. Me too. Yeah, all right. So those of us raising our hands, those of you that aren't raising your hands, we are the people who on any given evening, we will get into a dark corner somewhere and we will listen to really sad music about other people's problems. That's what we will do, right? Those of us that raise our hands oh yeah, I just like just feeling the angst, right? In fact, there's this blues club in New York City that over the last decade or so I've gone to probably a dozen times. And it's always fascinating. I always have this one moment where I'm sitting in this little spot and there's usually these great local blues musicians that are there, and they're singing songs about how bad their life is, and some of them they've written themselves because their lives are really that bad. And I'll sit in this little place and I'll look around the room, and it always fascinates me because there's West Coast people and East Coast people and Midwest people, and there's people from Switzerland and Australia and all over the world. You look in the room and there's just all these people from all these socioeconomic backgrounds and language barrier, all these different things, and we've all gathered in the room because we love blues. We love listening to somebody sing about their pain, right? She left me, the dog died. You think country music's depressing? The blues is way more depressing. It can drive you deep into a hole, okay? So it just fascinates me. So I always have this moment when I'm at this place and I look around, I'm like, isn't it interesting that we've all come from all of these different places so that we could listen to someone be sad in front of us? Kind of interesting. Why? Why? And some of you that didn't raise your hand, you're like, exactly, that's why I don't listen to that music. It sucks, right? But those of us that raise our hands, we're like, why? What draws us? What compels us and pulls us in? Well, think about this. I've because of my recreational activities over the years, I have quite a few unusual scars on my body. In fact, my wife has coined a saying these days as I venture out on any one of my adventures, and I think she spends too much time with accountants these days, but my wife's line to me as I'm leaving the door is this. She often says, hey, remember our motto, mitigate risk. which really has become a thing. Like now, like I'll be on a mountain bike somewhere and I'm like, mitigate risk, mitigate risk, mitigate risk. Because we've spent way too much money on doctor bills for me. And I've had way too many things sewn back together and like torn apart. And so I've got these scars. And every now and then, usually this happens in the summer, I'll be at the lake or at a pool and somebody will see something, something crazy on my arm or, my back. Looks like I got shot, something like that. I gored myself with my handlebars one time, like drove it into my abdomen, all kinds of really fun stuff. And then pretended to my wife that it didn't happen, and she caught me hiding this giant bloody hematoma. There's a reason she says things like, mitigate risk, just so you know. It is a well-founded saying for our family. But every now and then I'll be out somewhere and someone will see one of my scars. And it's always funny, because with every scar, there's a story, right? How many of you have scars? How many of you have a great story that goes with your scar, right? Like for me, there's always this thing, and this is what happens. If I start to tell the story of a scar that I have, I start to unpack it, as I'm wrapping up, somebody else is like, oh yeah, well check this out, right? And they're like, oh yeah, this, and you get a bunch of guys together and they're like pulling off their shirts, like, back in Nam, there was this back here, and whenever the back in Nam guy comes along, I'm like, yeah, my mountain bike stuff really sounds sissy right now, But there's this funny thing where we all have scars and we all have stories, and for some reason, when someone shares about their scar, everybody else jumps in and starts talking about their scars, and we all listen and we all identify, and we're all like, yeah, there's something about another human being having to sew you back up that requires you to tell this story, right? Why? Why do we tell those stories, and why do we all listen? Why do we share those kinds of things? Why do we listen to sad music about another person's hardship? Why do we do this? I think it has to do with the work that God is doing through us. And here's why I say this. There's a really beautiful thing that happens when you have gone through a particular kind of suffering, and then you meet a person, and they themselves are walking through, or have walked through, that same particular kind of suffering. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like when you've gone through something and then you meet someone, like for me, when I've listened to a person's story and then I realize that their story is like my story and I tell my story to them, there's this moment where you look each other in the eyes and you go, me too. And there's this bond that happens. Like, you get it. You understand me. You know what I'm going through right now. And it feels in that moment like there's nobody else in the world, because something beautiful happens there, right? When I hear your sad story, when I listen about your scars, when those things resonate with something that's happened in my life, there is this connection that happens in those moments. And something beautiful happens, and we realize I am not alone in this. We begin to realize that God has comforted me so that I can comfort others. God has not left me alone so that I don't leave others alone. God has not abandoned me so that I don't abandon others. He stood with me so I can stand with others. We realize that the work that God has done in me, He's done so that I can now do that with another person. And I believe it is something beautiful. It is beautiful when comfort begins to spread this way, when care and compassion spread this way. In fact, I believe it should happen frequently in the body of Christ. There is something sweet about seeing people redeem their stories and redeem their lives, redeem even the valleys by turning their eyes off of themselves and onto another person so that that person can find strength in their moments of crisis and trial. See, this is how I tend to think about this. I tend to think about suffering in life in this way, like when you and I are born, it's like somebody issues us a backpack, except the backpack is empty. So we got this backpack and we sort of begin our journey into life. But then for some of us at a very early age, there are things that happen, right? There are crisis moments, and there's suffering, and there's pain, and there's hardship. There's loss. There's rejection. There's firings, there's dreams that don't come true, there's nightmares that never end, there's abuses. And this is the way it seems to be. We're issued this backpack at the beginning of our lives, and every time one of these things happen, every time we walk through a valley, every time we walk through a painful moment, it's like somebody takes this thing and they write that moment on this weight, and then they put that weight inside of this pack, and then we carry it around, and then we're moving through our life and something else happens. Somebody else disappoints us, somebody else hurts us or harms us, and we take that, and again, it's inscribed on that weight, and we pile it in. And so the longer you go through life and the more you experience suffering and pain, the heavier this thing becomes, the more weight that's now bearing down on your back. And if you live long enough and you carry these things along with you, eventually you will grow weary and you will grow tired, and it will bear down on you and affecting the energy you have and your strength to go on and your perspective on life, because all of the weight of all the suffering and pain and hardship and valleys are on your back. But then you meet somebody and they begin to tell their story, and as they tell their story, it's like somebody opens up the backpack. And you begin to look inside and you begin to see your story. And as you look at your story and you begin to pull these things out and you really recognize what they are and what's gone on, as you begin to share those things with the people around you, the very things that were causing pain and a burden and a weight for you become sustenance and life to another person. The story that you've been carrying on your back, that you've been hiding, that you've been holding inside, when you begin to open this up and give it to another person, the very thing that was weighing you down begins to lift another person up. It's the food, it's the water that they needed for the journey. It's the one thing that now tells them, I can get through this. And so we just continue. We take these things out and we give them. We tell our story. We share the things that have gone on. We talk about the valleys. We bear each other's burdens, and we share these things with one another. And as we do, this pack that we've been carrying around with all of these moments that we wish we could forget, suddenly it becomes light. The burden is light, and the journey begins to change, and somehow feelings of joy and purpose and meaning begin to fill spaces that once were characterized by pain and heartache and loss. That's the beauty. It's the beauty of what it means to live in community with others and to walk through suffering with one another. When you open it up, you discover something. And there's something powerful that happens. So the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, he was writing about the church, and he was talking about the church as a body of Christ. And he talks about the hands and the feet and the eyes and the ears and how all of this is connected, how all of us are parts of this intricate body and how we are all connected. And it's this beautiful illustration of how all of us matter with all of our gifts and abilities and all of our different stories. But then towards the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 12, in verse 26, he says something fascinating. He says, if one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. Now you are the body of Christ and individually members of it. It's this idea of sharing in each other's sufferings. We are in this together for each other. And so, yes, there's a purpose and a meaning in our valley. Yes, God's working in good ways in our hearts and in us. He's shaping us, but He's also working through us to impact those that are around us. So I want to do something right now that's probably going to require a little bit of courage on some of your part. I'm going to ask a question, and I think it's a good example of what we're talking about, pulling these things out and holding them out for others to see. I think it's a good part of us being an authentic community like Nick was talking about earlier. But I'm going to ask a question, and if this is true of you, I just want you to stand up and kind of stay standing for a little bit. I promise I won't make it too awkward for you. Well, it's always awkward to just stand up randomly in church, but I'll try not to make it too awkward. But if this is true of you, I'd like you to stand. How many of you have either had cancer yourself or you've lost somebody that you love because of cancer? Stand with me. And just take a moment, those of you that are standing, and would you just look around real quickly? Take a moment and look at who's standing with you. All of you are standing together right now. And you share this. You share this part of your story. And you can be seated now. But I want you to think about this. How many times do you feel alone in those moments? And then you realize in a place like this, in a space like this, that 3/4 of us, all day long, 3/4 of us have stood together with the mention of one word, and that word's cancer. And as isolating and as lonely as that can feel, when we begin to look at each other and say, wait a second, right now what all of you did was you looked at each other and said, I am not alone, and you are not alone. It's this beautiful thing that happens in the body of Christ. It's this incredible thing, like one word spoken, and there's a bond that you immediately have, and you go, okay, me too, me too. Do you realize that suffering has a way of doing that success or affluence or money could never do? You realize that? Like there's only a few words that I could mention that would create that moment. If I decided to talk about Ford trucks and said, all of you that drive Ford trucks, stand up, you would stand up and you wouldn't feel this bond. You wouldn't look at each other and go, yeah, me too. I drive a Ford. You drive a Ford? Yes. Or if you really like chicken, all of you that really love chicken, stand up. And some of you stand and be like, I love chicken. You love chicken. Yes, there's this bond over chicken. Chicken's just good. Or like all of you who had the resources to get out of here this winter and go to Hawaii, stand up. And we'd all peg you with something and hate you for just a moment. But then you don't look across the room and be like, yes, well, the Maui, yes, I got this bond with you. No, it's like, yeah, that's cool for you. You too, me too. But then you say one word like cancer and there's something deeper. And I believe that's because God is working things for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. I believe that God works in the middle of those moments, and there is this beautiful art of solidarity that happens. There is this beautiful thing that happens in suffering. So tonight, I want to close by showing you a few stories of a few people here at Summit that truly felt like telling their story was good for other people to hear so that someone else could hear, me too. I've been there. And so I just want you to sit back for a minute and here are some folks that have walked through some valleys. Let's watch this together, and then I'll come back up and close us in a couple of minutes.
Well, I'm Jessica, and when I was 20 years old, I lost my dad. To say it was easy would definitely not be true. My dad is my hero, will forever be my hero. He's the first man that has ever loved me. He's the first man that fell in love with me. So to lose my dad was to lose a huge chunk of who I am.
So when we had Jacob, pretty normal, and started noticing at about 4 months that he was not developing the way typical kiddos do.
Our oldest son died. It'll be 20 years this July. And we just think about it every day. We are 20 years removed from it, and we still think about it every day.
You know, I planned on having a son that was fine. And so when I had to give that up, I literally had to give it up. I actually had to go through like a mourning and the loss of my son that I thought. So that was tough,
So you turn back and you lean into it. And it really caused me, not so much Kathy, but it really caused me to then probably go on, I guess, the best way to describe it's a long journey. I had to kind of dismantle my faith. All of it had to be transformed and changed.
To become real.
Yeah. So
I'd have moments of, thank you, Lord, for Jacob. And then moments of, why do I have to have this? Why? You start frustrated with the life that I've received or the path that we're going down because Jacob is the way that he is. And I've just always seemed to find a peace where I become something a little bit better as I've gone through what we've gone through. And I can always settle down at the end of it and go, okay, I'm not happy with the way things are. I'm not satisfied in any way. but I'm okay with what you have for me.
It was dark. It was very, very dark. And when it first happened, I was angry. I was angry at God. I was angry at why this would ever happen in my life. I was asking the question of why. I think when we are in valleys, we ask why and we question God. And it's so ironic because Jesus tells us, don't fear, don't worry, don't have anxiety. And yet our first human response is to do those three things.
I think one of the biggest pieces of hope that I hold on to, even every day, is the hope of heaven. And, there's so many times where I think, God, why can't you heal him? Why is he not able to participate in life in what seems like a meaningful way? I love what the Bible has to say about our life being but a breath. It's just a blip, this life. In regards to looking at what is eternity, this is just a breath. Just breathe in and breathe out. And then we have a happily ever after.
Yeah.
It will be perfect someday. And God will heal someday.
Mm-hmm.
And those things keep me grounded.
I find comfort in the fact that, Jesus, who suffered it all, who walked through the darkest of things, who experienced something I could never imagine experiencing, is there holding me, holding my hands, walking me through every night that I cry because I miss my dad, or when I see a picture and I'm just reminded of, that memory or how much I miss him and wish that he was here. He's just there holding me. And it's this overwhelming peace because I'm not alone and he understands.
When you pray to God and you ask him to do something so important to you and he doesn't do it, then was he not good? And I hear a lot of people, even Christian people, saying, God was so good, nobody got sick today. Or God is so good, I got the job, and those are good things. But God is good even though Eli died. And God is good even though you didn't get the job, because he's good all the time. And whatever it is he has for us is good, even though we can't always see it.
I really feel like Jacob has done something for us that is, we're very fortunate to have him, even though it's been difficult. And it's only in the struggle. If you're gonna, whether it be, you don't just wake up one day and go, oh, I'm in great shape. It takes some time to get in shape. So the struggle is you beat your body to the point where you get in good shape. Or if you want to be good at playing the piano, you don't just wake up, unless you're a savant, you don't wake up and just start playing. It takes time to become a good piano player. In this struggle that we've had with Jacob, it's taken time, but we've realized what a blessing it is to have him. And
It's taught me so much about who God is, that he loves without expecting love back. And that is a gift that Jacob has given us, the ability to love without needing love in return. I can't lie. There's days I wish when he pushes me away, or he doesn't look me in the eye, or I just want connection with him. I do. I want those things back, but I choose to love regardless. And that's how God loves us.